could not dispense with the earnings of their children and live on the scale of wages which they obtained. The representatives of 514,000 workers voted against the resolution, while the representatives of 535,000 workers voted in favor of it. When 514,000 workers oppose a resolution prohibiting child labor under 15, it is evident that a less-than-living wage is being paid to an immense number of the adult workers of the country. I have spoken with women in Whitechapel who receive right along less than 1 shilling for a 12-hour day in the coat-making sweatshops, and with women trousers finishers who receive an average princely and weekly wage of 3 to 4 shillings. A case recently cropped up of men in the employ of a wealthy business house receiving their board and 6 shillings per week for 6 working days of 16 hours each. The sandwich men get 14 pence per day and find themselves. The average weekly earnings of the hawkers and costermongers are not more than 10 to 12 shillings. The average of all common labourers outside the dockers is less than 16 shillings per week, while the dockers average from 8 to 9 shillings. These figures are taken from a Royal Commission report and are authentic. Conceive an old woman, broken and dying, supporting herself and 4 children, and paying 3 shillings per week rent, by making matchboxes at 2.25 pence per gross, 12 dozen boxes for 2.25 pence, and in addition finding her own paste and thread. She never knew a day off, either for sickness, rest, or recreation. Each day and every day, Sundays as well, she toiled 14 hours. Her day's stint was 7 gross, for which she received 1 shilling 3.75 pence. In the week of 98 hours' work, she made 7,066 matchboxes and earned 4 shillings 10.25 pence, less per paste and thread. Last year, Mr. Thomas Holmes, a police court missionary of note, after writing about the condition of the women workers, received the following letter, dated April 18, 1901. Sir, pardon the liberty I am taking, but having read what you said about poor women working 14 hours a day for 10 shillings per week, I beg to state my case. I am a tie-maker who, after working all week, cannot earn more than 5 shillings, and I have a poor afflicted husband to keep who hasn't earned a penny for more than 10 years. Imagine a woman capable of writing such a clear, sensible, grammatical letter supporting her husband and self on 5 shillings per week. Mr. Holmes visited her. He had to squeeze to get into the room. There lay her sick husband. There she worked all day long. There she cooked, ate, washed and slept. And there her husband and she performed all the functions of living and dying. There was no space for the missionary to sit down, save on the bed, which was partially covered with ties and silk. The sick man's lungs were in the last stages of decay. He coughed and expectorated constantly, the woman ceasing from her work to assist him in his paroxysms. The silken fluff from the ties was not good for his sickness, nor was his sickness good for the ties and the handlers and wearers of the ties yet to come. Another case Mr. Holmes visited was that of a young girl, 12 years of age, charged in the police court with stealing food. He found her the deputy mother of a boy of 9, a crippled boy of 7, and a younger child. Her mother was a widow and a blouse maker. She paid 5 shillings a week rent. Here are the last items in her housekeeping account. Tea, 0.5 pence. Sugar, 0.5 pence. Bread, 0.25 pence. Margarine, 1 pence. Oil, 1.5 pence. And firewood, 1 pence. Good housewives of the soft and tender folk, imagine yourselves marketing and keeping house on such a scale, setting a table for 5 and keeping an eye on your deputy mother of 12 to see that she did not steal food for her little brothers and sisters. The while you stitched at a nightmare line of blouses, which stretched away into the gloom and down to the pauper's coffin, a yawn for you. Chapter 19. The Ghetto. Is it well that while we range with science, glorying in the time, city children soak and blacken soul and sense in city slime? There among the gloomy alleys, progress halts on palsied feet, crime and hunger cast out maidens by the thousand on the street. Their master scrimps his haggard seamstress of her daily bread. There the single-sworded attic holds the living and the dead. There the smouldering fire of fever creeps across the rotted floor, and the crowded couch of incest in the warrens of the poor. At one time the nations of Europe confined the undesirable Jews in city ghettos, but today the dominant economic class, by less arbitrary but none the less rigorous methods, has confined the undesirable yet necessary workers into ghettos of remarkable meanness and vastness. East London is such a ghetto, where the rich and the powerful do not dwell, and the traveller cometh not, and where 2 million workers swarm, procreate, and die. It must not be supposed that all the workers of London are crowded into the East End, but the tide is setting strongly in that direction. The poor quarters of the city proper are constantly being destroyed, and the main stream of the unhoused is toward the east. In the last 12 years, one district, London over the border as it is called, which lies well beyond Aldgate, Whitechapel and Mile End, has increased 260,000, or over 60%. The churches in this district, by the way, can seat but 1 in every 37 of the added population. The city of dreadful monotony, the East End is often called, especially by well-fed, optimistic sightseers, who look over the surface of things and are merely shocked by the intolerable sameness and meanness of it all. If the East End is worthy of no worse than a title than City of the Dreadful Monotony, and if working people are unworthy of variety and beauty and surprise, it would not be such a bad place in which to live. But the East End does merit a worse title. It should be called the City of Degradation. While it is not a city of slums, as some people imagine, it may well be said to be one gigantic slum. From the standpoint of simple decency and clean manhood and womanhood, any mean street of all its mean streets is a slum, where sights and sounds above which neither you nor I would care to have our children see and hear, is a place where no man's children should live and see and hear, where you and I would not care to have our wives pass their lives, is a place where no other man's wife should have to pass her life. For here, in the East End, the obscenities and brute vulgarities of life are rampant. There is no privacy. The bad corrupts the good, and all fester together. Innocent childhood is sweet and beautiful, but not in East London. Innocence is a fleeing thing, and you must catch them before they crawl out of the cradle, or you'll find the very babes as unholily as you. The application of the Golden Rule determines that East London is an unfit place in which to live. Where would you not have your own babe live and develop and gather to itself knowledge of life and the things of life? Is not a fit place for the babes of other men to live and develop and gather to themselves knowledge of life and the things of life? It is a simple thing, this Golden Rule, and all that is required. Political economy and the survival of the fittest can go hang if they say otherwise. What is not good enough for you is not good enough for other men, and there's no more to be said. There are 300,000 people in London, divided into families that live in one-room tenements. Far, far more live in 2 and 3 rooms and are as badly crowded, regardless of sex, and those that live in one room. The law demands 400 cubic feet of space for each person. In army barracks, each soldier is allowed 600 cubic feet. Professor Huxley, at one time himself a medical officer in East London, always held that each person should have 800 cubic feet of space, and that it should be well ventilated with pure air. Yet in London, there are 900,000 people living in less than 400 cubic feet prescribed by the law. Mr. Charles Booth, who engaged in a systematic work of years in charting and classifying the toiling city population, estimates that there are 1,800,000 people in London who are poor and very poor. By poor, he means families which have a total weekly income from 18 to 21 shillings. The very poor fall greatly below this standard. The workers, as a class, are being more and more segregated by their economic masters, and this process, with its jamming and overcrowding, tends not so much toward immorality as unmorality. Here is an extract from a recent meeting of the London County Council, terse and bald, but with a wealth of horror to be read between the lines. Mr. Bruce asked the chairman of the Public Health Committee whether his attention had been called to a number of cases of serious overcrowding in the East End. In St. George's in the East, a man and his wife and their family of 8 occupied one small room. This family consisted of 5 daughters aged 20, 17, 8, 4, and an infant, and 3 sons aged 15, 13, and 12. In Whitechapel, a man and his wife and their 3 daughters aged 16, 8, and 4, and 2 sons aged 10 and 12 occupied a smaller room. In Bethnal Green, a man and his wife, with 4 sons aged 23, 21, 19, and 16, and 2 daughters aged 14 and 7, were also found in one room. He asked whether it was not the duty of the various local authorities to prevent such serious overcrowding. But with 900,000 people actually living under illegal conditions, the authorities have their hands full. When the overcrowded folk are ejected, they stray off into some other hole, and, as they move their belongings by night, on hand barrows, one hand barrow accommodating the entire household goods and the sleeping children, it is next to impossible to keep track of them. If the Public Health Act of 1891 were suddenly and completely enforced, 900,000 people would receive notice to clear out of their houses and go onto the streets, and 500,000 rooms would have to be built before they were all legally housed again. The mean streets merely look mean from the outside, but inside the walls are to be found squalor, misery, and tragedy. While the following tragedy may be revolting to read, it must not be forgotten that the existence of it is far more revolting. In Devonshire Place, Lisson Grove, a short while back, died an old woman of 75 years of age. At the inquest, the coroner's officer stated that all he found in the room was a lot of old rags covered with vermin. He had got himself smothered with the vermin. The room was in a shocking condition, and he had never seen anything like it. Everything was absolutely covered with vermin. The doctor said he found the deceased lying across the fender on her back. She had one garment and her stockings on. The body was quite alive with vermin, and all the clothes in the room were absolutely grey with insects. Deceased was very badly nourished and was very emaciated. She had extensive sores on her legs. and her stockings were adherent to those sores. Those sores were the result of vermin. A man present at the inquest wrote, "I had the evil fortune to see the body of the unfortunate woman as it lay in the mortuary, and even now the memory of that gruesome sight makes me shudder. There she lay in the mortuary shell, so starved and emaciated that she was a mere bundle of skin and bones. Her hair, which was matted with filth, was simply a nest of vermin. Over her bony chest leaped and rolled hundreds, thousands, myriads of vermin. If it is not good for your mother and my mother so to die, then it is not good for this woman, whosever mother she might be, so to die." Bishop Wilkinson, who had survived in Zululand, recently said, "No human of an African village would allow such a promiscuous mixing of young men and women, boys and girls." He had reference to the children of the overcrowded folk, who at 5 had nothing to learn and much to unlearn, which they will never unlearn. It is notorious that here in the ghetto the houses of the poor are greater profit earners than the mansions of the rich. Not only does the poor worker have to live like a beast, but he pays proportionately more for it than does the rich man for his spacious comfort. A class of house sweaters has been made possible by the competition of the poor for houses. There are more people than there is room, and numbers are in the workhouse because they cannot find shelter elsewhere. Not only are houses let, but they are sublet, and sub-sublet down to the very rooms. A part of a room to let. This notice was posted a short while ago in a window not 5 minutes' walk from St. James's Hall. The Reverend Hugh Price Hughes is authority for the statement that beds are let on the 3-relay system, that is, 3 tenants to a bed, each occupying it 8 hours, so that it never grows cold, while the floor space underneath the bed is likewise let on the 3-relay system. Health officers are not at all unused to find such cases as the following. In one room having a cubic capacity of 1,000 feet, 3 adult females in a bed, and 2 adult females under the bed, and in one room of 1,650 cubic feet, 1 adult male and 2 children in the bed, and 2 adult females under the bed. Here is a typical example of a room on the more respectable 2-relay system. It is occupied in the daytime by a young woman employed all night in a hotel. At 7 o'clock in the evening she vacates the room, and a bricklayer's labourer comes in. At 7 in the morning he vacates, and goes to his work, at which time she returns from hers. The Reverend W. N. Davis, rector of Spitalfields, took a census of some of the alleys in his parish. He says, "In one alley there are 10 houses, 51 rooms, nearly all about 8 feet by 9 feet, and 254 people. In 6 instances only do 2 people occupy one room, and in others the number varied from 3 to 9. In another court with 6 houses and 22 rooms were 84 people. Again, 6, 7, 8, and 9 being the number living in one room in several instances. In one house with 8 rooms are 45 people, one room containing 9 persons, one 8, 2 7, and another 6. This ghetto crowding is not through inclination but compulsion. Nearly 50% of the workers pay from 1/4 to 1/2 of their earnings for rent. The average rent in a larger part of the East End is from 4 to 6 shillings per week for one room, while skilled mechanics earning 35 shillings per week are forced to part with 15 shillings of it for 2 or 3 poky little dens, in which they strive desperately to obtain some semblance of home life. And rents are going up all the time. In one street in Stepney, the increase in only 2 years has been from 13 to 18 shillings. in another street from 11 to 16 shillings, and in another street from 11 to 15 shillings. While in Whitechapel, 2-room houses that recently rented for 10 shillings are now costing 21 shillings. East, west, north and south, the rents are going up. When the land is worth from £20,000 to £30,000 an acre, someone must pay the landlord. Mr. W.C. Stedman in the House of Commons, in a speech concerning his constituency in Stepney, related the following. This morning, not 100 yards from where I am myself living, a widow stopped me. She has 6 children to support, and the rent of her house was 14 shillings per week. She gets her living by letting the house to lodgers and doing a day's washing or charring. That woman, with tears in her eyes, told me that the landlord had increased the rent from 14 shillings to 18 shillings. What could the woman do? There is no accommodation in Stepney. Every place is taken up and overcrowded. Class supremacy can rest only on class degradation, and when the workers are segregated in the ghetto, they cannot escape the consequent degradation. A short and stunted people is created, a breed strikingly differentiated from their master's breed, a pavement folk, as it were, lacking stamina and strength. The men become caricatures of what physical men ought to be, and their women and children are pale and anemic, with eyes ringed darkly, who stoop and slouch, and are early twisted out of all shapeliness and beauty. To make matters worse, the men of the ghetto are the men who are left, a deteriorated stock, left to undergo still further deterioration. For 150 years at least, they have been drained of their best. The strong men, the men of pluck, initiative and ambition, have been faring forth to the fresher and freer portions of the globe, to make new lands and nations. Those who are lacking, the weak of heart and head and hand, as well as the rotten and hopeless, have remained to carry on the breed. And year by year, in turn, the best they breed are taken from them. Wherever a man of vigour and stature manages to grow up, he is hailed forthwith into the army. A soldier, as Bernard Shaw has said, ostensibly a heroic and patriotic defender of his country, is really an unfortunate man driven by destitution to offer himself as food for powder for the sake of regular rations, shelter, and clothing. This constant selection of the best from the workers has impoverished those who are left, a sadly degraded reminder for the great part which in the ghetto sinks to the deepest depths. The wine of life has been drawn off to spill itself in blood and progeny over the rest of the earth. Those that remain are the lees, and they are segregated and steeped in themselves. They become indecent and bestial. When they kill with their hands, and then stupidly surrender themselves to the executioners. There is no splendid audacity about their transgressions. They gouge a mate with a dull knife, or beat his head in with an iron pot, and then sit down and wait for the police. Wife-beating is the masculine prerogative of matrimony. They wear remarkable boots of brass and iron, and when they have polished off the mother of their children with a black eye or so, they knock her down and proceed to trample her very much as a western stallion tramples a rattlesnake. A woman of the lower ghetto classes is as much the slave of her husband as is the Indian squaw. And I, for one, were I a woman and had but the two choices, should prefer being a squaw. The men are economically dependent on their masters, and the women are economically dependent on the men. The result is, the woman gets the beating the man should give his master, and she can do nothing. There are the kiddies, and he is the breadwinner, and she dare not send him to jail and leave herself and children to starve. Evidence to convict can rarely be obtained when such cases come into the courts. As a rule, the trampled wife and mother is weeping and hysterically beseeching the magistrate to let her husband off for the kiddies' sakes. The wives become screaming harridans or broken-spirited and dog-like, lose what little decency and self-respect they have remaining over from their maiden days, and all sink together, unheeding in their degradation and dirt. Sometimes I become afraid of my own generalizations upon the massed misery of this ghetto life, and feel that my impressions are exaggerated, that I am too close to the picture and lack perspective. At such moments, I find it well to turn to the testimony of other men, to prove to myself that I am not becoming overwrought and addle-pated. Frederick Harrison has always struck me as being a level-headed, well-controlled man, and he says, "To me at least, it would be enough to condemn modern society as hardly an advance on slavery or serfdom, if the permanent condition of industry were to be that which we behold, that 90% of the actual producers of wealth have no home that they can call their own beyond the end of the week, have no bit of soil or so much as a room that belongs to them, have nothing of value of any kind except as much old furniture as will go into a cart, have the precarious chance of weekly wages which barely suffice to keep them in health, are housed for the most part in places that no man thinks fit for his horse, are separated by so narrow a margin from destitution that a month of bad trade, sickness, or unexpected loss brings them face to face with hunger and pauperism. But below this normal state of the average workman in town and country, there is found the great band of destitute outcasts, the camp of followers of the army of industry, at least 1/10 the whole proletarian population, whose normal condition is one of sickening wretchedness. If this is to be the permanent arrangement of modern society, civilization must be held to bring a curse on the great majority of mankind. 90%! The figures are appalling, yet Mr. Stopford Brooke, after drawing a frightful London picture, finds himself compelled to multiply it by 500,000. Here it is. I often used to meet, when I was curate at Kensington, families drifting into London along the Hammersmith Road. One day there came along a labourer and his wife, his son and 2 daughters. Their family had lived for a long time on an estate in the country, and managed, with the help of the common land and their labour, to get on. But the time came when the common was encroached upon, and their labour was not needed on the estate, and they were quietly turned out of their cottage. Where should they go? Of course to London, where work was thought to be plentiful. They had a little savings, and they thought they could get 2 decent rooms to live in. But the inexorable land question met them in London. They tried the decent courts for lodgings and found that 2 rooms would cost 10 shillings a week. Food was dear and bad, water was bad, and in a short time their health suffered. Work was hard to get, and its wage was so low that they were soon in debt. They became more ill and more despairing with the poisonous surroundings, the darkness, and the long hours of work, and they were driven forth to seek a cheaper lodging. They found it in a court I knew well, a hotbed of crime and nameless horrors. In this they got a single room at a cruel rent, and work was more difficult for them to get now, as they came from a place of such bad repute, and they fell into the hands of those who sweat the last drop out of man and woman and child, for wages which are the food only of despair. And the darkness and the dirt, the bad food and the sickness, and the want of water was worse than before, and the crowd and the companionship of the court robbed them of the last shreds of self-respect. The drink demon seized upon them. Of course, there was a public house at both ends of the court. There they fled, one and all, for shelter and warmth and society and forgetfulness. And they came out in deeper debt, with inflamed senses and burning brains, and an unsatisfied craving for drink they would do anything to satiate. And in a few months the father was in prison, the wife dying, the son a criminal, and the daughters on the street. Multiply this by 500,000, and you will be beneath the truth. No more dreary spectacle can be found on this earth than the whole of the awful East, with its Whitechapel, Hoxton, Spitalfields, Bethnal Green, and Wapping to the East India Docks. The colour of life is grey and drab. Everything is helpless, hopeless, unrelieved, and dirty. Bath-tubs are a thing totally unknown, as mythical as the ambrosia of the gods. The people themselves are dirty, while any attempt at cleanliness becomes howling farce when it is not pitiful and tragic. Strange vagrant odours come drifting along the greasy wind, and the rain, when it falls, is more like grease than water from heaven. The very cobblestones are scummed with grease. Here lives a population as dull and unimaginative as its long grey miles of dingy brick. Religion has virtually passed it by, and a gross and stupid materialism reigns, fatal alike to the things of the spirit and the finer instincts of life. It used to be the proud boast that every Englishman's home was his castle, but today it is an anachronism. The ghetto folk have no homes. They do not know the significance and the sacredness of home life. Even the municipal dwellings where live the better class workers are overcrowded barracks. They have no home life. The very language proves it. The father returning from work asks his child in the street where his mother is, and back the answer comes, in the buildings. A new race has sprung up, a street people. They pass their lives at work and in the streets. They have dens and lairs into which they crawl for sleeping purposes, and that is all. One cannot travesty the word by calling such dens and lairs homes. The traditional silent and reserved Englishman has passed away. The pavement folk are noisy, voluble, high-strung, excitable, when they are yet young. As they grow older, they become steeped and stupefied in beer. When they have nothing else to do, they ruminate as a cow ruminates. They are to be met with everywhere, standing on curbs and corners and staring into vacancy. Watch one of them. He will stand there motionless for hours, and when you go away, you will leave him still staring into vacancy. It is most absorbing. He has no money for beer, and his lair is only for sleeping purposes. So what else remains for him to do? He has already solved the mysteries of girl's love, and wife's love, and child's love, and found them delusions and shams, vain and fleeting as dewdrops, quick vanishing before the ferocious facts of life. As I say, the young are high-strung, nervous, excitable. The middle-aged are empty-headed, stolid, and stupid. It is absurd to think for an instant that they can compete with the workers of the New World. Brutalized, degraded, and dull, the ghetto folk will be unable to render efficient service to England in the world struggle for industrial supremacy, which economists declare has already begun. Neither as workers nor as soldiers can they come up to the mark when England, in her need, calls upon them, her forgotten ones. And if England be flung out of the world's industrial orbit, they will perish like flies at the end of summer. Or, with England critically situated, and with them made desperate as wild beasts are made desperate, they may become a menace and go swelling down to the West End to return the slumming the West End has done in the East, in which case, before rapid guns and the modern machinery of warfare, they will perish the more swiftly and easily. Chapter 20. Coffee Houses and Doss Houses. Another phrase gone glimmering, shorn of romance and tradition, and all that goes to make phrases worth keeping. For me, henceforth, coffee house will possess anything but an agreeable connotation. Over on the other side of the world, the mere mention of the word was sufficient to conjure up whole crowds of its historic frequenters, and to send trooping through my imagination endless groups of wits and dandies, pamphleteers and bravos, and bohemians of Grub Street. But here, on this side of the world, alas and alack, the very name is a misnomer. Coffee house, a place where people drink coffee. Not at all. You cannot obtain coffee in such a place for love or money. True, you may call for coffee, and you will have brought you something in a cup purporting to be coffee, and you will taste it and be disillusioned, for coffee it certainly is not. And what is true of the coffee is true of the coffee house. Working men in the main frequent these places, and greasy, dirty places they are, without one thing about them to cherish decency in a man or put self-respect into him. Tablecloths and napkins are unknown. A man eats in the midst of the debris left by his predecessor, and dribbles his own scraps about him on the floor. In rush times, in such places, I have positively waded through the muck and mess that covered the floor, and I have managed to eat because I was abominably hungry and capable of eating anything. This seems to be the normal condition of the working man, from the zest with which he addresses himself to the board. Eating is a necessity, and there are no frills about it. He brings in with him a primitive voraciousness, and, I am confident, carries away with him a fairly healthy appetite. When you see such a man on his way to work in the morning, order a pint of tea, which is no more tea than it is ambrosia. Pull a hunk of dry bread from his pocket and wash the one down with the other. Depend upon it, the man has not the right sort of stuff in his belly, nor enough of the wrong sort of stuff to fit him for a day's work. And further, depend upon it, he and 1,000 of his kind will not turn out the quantity or quality of work that 1,000 men will who have eaten heartily of meat and potatoes and drunk coffee that is coffee. As a vagrant in the hobo of a California jail, I have been served better food and drink than the London workman receives in his coffee houses, while as an American labourer I have eaten a breakfast for 12 pence, such as the British labourer would not dream of eating. Of course, he will pay only 3 or 4 pence for his, which is, however, as much as I paid, for I would be earning 6 shillings to his 2 or 2.5. On the other hand, though, and in return, I would turn out an amount of work in the course of the day that would put to shame the amount he turned out. So there are two sides to it. The man with the high standard of living will always do more work and better than the man with the low standard of living. There is a comparison which sailor men make between the English and American merchant services. In an English ship, they say, it is poor grub, poor pay, and easy work. In an American ship, good grub, good pay, and hard work. And this is applicable to the working populations of both countries. The ocean greyhounds have to pay for speed and steam, and so does the workman. But if the workman is not able to pay for it, he will not have the speed and steam. That is all. The proof of it is when the English workman comes to America. He will lay more bricks in New York than he will in London, still more bricks in St. Louis, and still more bricks when he gets to San Francisco. Note 3. His standard of living has been rising all the time. Early in the morning, along the streets frequented by workmen on the way to work, many women sit on the sidewalk with sacks of bread beside them. No end of workmen purchase these and eat them as they walk along. They do not even wash the dry bread down with the tea to be obtained for a penny in the coffee houses. It is incontestable that a man is not fit to begin his day's work on a meal like that, and it is equally incontestable that the loss will fall upon his employer and upon the nation. For some time now, statesmen have been crying, "Wake up, England!" It would show more hard-headed common sense if they changed the tune to "Feed up, England." Not only is the worker poorly fed, but he is filthily fed. I have stood outside a butcher's shop and watched a horde of speculative housewives turning over the trimmings and scraps and shreds of beef and mutton, dog meat in the States. I would not vouch for the clean fingers of these housewives, no more than I would vouch for the cleanliness of the single rooms in which many of them and their families lived. Yet they raked and poured and scraped the mess about in their anxiety to get the worth of their coppers. I kept my eye on one particularly offensive-looking bit of meat and followed it through the clutches of over 20 women, till it fell to the lot of a timid-appearing little woman who the butcher bluffed into taking it. All day long, this heap of scraps was added to and taken away from, the dust and dirt of the street falling upon it, flies settling on it, and the dirty fingers turning it over and over. The costers wheel loads of specked and decaying fruit around in barrows all day, and very often store it in their one living space and sleeping room for the night. There it is, exposed to the sickness and disease, the effluvia and vile exhalations of overcrowded and rotten life, and next day is carted about again to be sold. The poor worker of the East End never knows what it is to eat good, wholesome meat or fruit. In fact, he rarely eats meat or fruit at all, while the skilled workman has nothing to boast of in the way of what he eats. Judging from the coffee houses, which is a fair criterion, they never know in all their lives what tea, coffee, or cocoa tastes like. The slops and water witcheries of the coffee houses, varying only in sloppiness and witchery, never even approximate or suggest what you and I are accustomed to drink as tea and coffee. A little incident comes to me, connected with a coffee house not far from Jubilee Street on the Mile End Road. "Can't you let me have something for this, daughter? Anything, I don't mind. I haven't had a bite the blessed day, and I am that faint." She was an old woman, clad in decent black rags, and in her hand she had a penny. The one she had addressed as daughter was a careworn woman of 40, proprietress and waitress of the house. I waited, possibly as anxious as the old woman, to see how the appeal would be received. It was 4 in the afternoon, and she looked faint and sick. The woman hesitated an instant, then brought a large plate of stewed lamb and young peas. I was eating a plate of it myself, and it is my judgment that the lamb was mutton, and that the peas might have been younger without being youthful. However, the point is, the dish was sold at 6pence, and the proprietress gave it for a penny, demonstrating anew the old truth that the poor are the most charitable. The old woman, profuse in her gratitude, took a seat on the other side of the narrow table and ravenously attacked the smoking stew. We ate steadily and silently, the pair of us, when suddenly, explosively and most gleefully, she cried out to me. "I sold a box of matches, yes," she confirmed, if anything with greater, more explosive glee. I sold a box of matches. That's how I got the penny. You must be getting along in years, I suggested. 74 yesterday, she replied, and returned with gusto to her plate. Blimey, I'd like to do something for the old girl, that I would. But this is the first I've had today, the young fellow alongside volunteered to me. And I only have this because I happen to be making an odd shilling washing out. Lord lummy, I don't know how many pots. No work at my own trade for 6 weeks, he said further in reply to my questions. Nothing but odd jobs and a blessed long way between. One meets with all sorts of adventures in a coffee house, and I shall not soon forget a Cockney Amazon in a place near Trafalgar Square, to whom I tendered a sovereign when paying my score. By the way, one is supposed to pay before he begins to eat, and if he be poorly dressed, he is compelled to pay before he eats. The girl bit the gold piece between her teeth, rang it on the counter, and then looked me and my rags witheringly up and down. Where do you find it? She at length demanded. Some mug left it on the table when he went out. Eh, don't you think? I retorted. What's your game? She queried, looking me calmly in the eyes. I make some, quoth I. She sniffed superciliously and gave me the change in small silver, and I had my revenge by biting and wringing every piece of it. I'll gi'e you halfpenny for another lump of sugar in the tea, I said. I'll see you in hell first, came the retort courteous. Also she amplified the retort courteous in divers vivid and unprintable ways. I never had much talent for repartee, but she knocked silly what little I had, and I gulped down my tea a beaten man, while she gloated after me, even as I passed out to the street. While 300,000 people of London live in one-room tenements and 900,000 are illegally and viciously housed, 38,000 more are registered as living in common lodging houses, known in the vernacular as doss houses. There are many kinds of doss houses, but in one thing they are all alike, from the filthy little ones to the monster big ones paying 5%. And blatantly lauded by smug middle-class men who know but one thing about them, and that one thing is their uninhabitableness. By this I do not mean that the roofs leak or the walls are draughty, but what I do mean is that life in them is degrading and unwholesome. The poor man's hotel, they are often called, but the phrase is caricature. Not to possess a room to oneself in which sometimes to sit alone, to be forced out of bed willy-nilly the first thing in the morning, to engage and pay anew for a bed each night, and never to have any privacy, surely is a mode of existence quite different from that of a hotel. This must not be considered a sweeping condemnation of the big private and municipal lodging houses and working men's homes. Far from it. They have remedied many of the atrocities attendant upon the irresistible small doss houses, and they give the workman more for his money than he ever received before. But that does not make them as habitable or wholesome as the dwelling place of a man should be, who does his work in the world. The little private doss house, as a rule, are unmitigated horrors. I have slept in them, and I know. But let me pass them by and confine myself to the bigger and better ones. Not far from Middlesex Street, Whitechapel, I entered such a house, a place inhabited almost entirely by working men. The entrance was by way of a flight of steps, descending from the sidewalk to what was properly the cellar of the building. Here were 2 large and gloomily lighted rooms in which men cooked and ate. I had intended to do some cooking myself, but the smell of the place stole away my appetite, or rather, wrested it from me. So I contented myself with watching other men cook and eat. One workman, home from work, sat down opposite me at the rough wooden table and began his meal. A handful of salt on the not over-clean table constituted his butter. Into it he dipped his bread, mouthful by mouthful, and washed it down with tea from a big mug. A piece of fish completed his bill of fare. He ate silently, looking neither to the right or left nor across at me. Here and there at the various tables, other men were eating, just as silently. In the whole room there was hardly a note of conversation. A feeling of gloom pervaded the ill-lighted place. Many of them sat and brooded over the crumbs of their repast, and made me wonder, as Childe Roland wondered, what evil they had done that they should be punished so. From the kitchen came the sounds of more genial life, and I ventured into the range where the men were cooking. But the smell I had noticed on entering was stronger here, and a rising nausea drove me into the street for fresh air. On my return, I paid 5p for a cabin, took my receipt for the same in the form of a huge brass cheque, and went upstairs to the smoking room. Here, a couple of small billiard tables and several checkerboards were being used by young working men, who waited in relays for their turn at the games, while many men were sitting around, smoking, reading, and mending their clothes. The young men were hilarious, the old men were gloomy. In fact, there were two types of men, the cheerful and the sodden or blue, and age seemed to determine the classification. But no more than 2 cellar rooms did this room convey the remotest suggestion of home. Certainly there could be nothing home-like about it to you and me, who know what home really is. On the walls were the most preposterous and insulting notices regulating the conduct of the guests, and at 10 o'clock the lights were put out, and nothing remained but bed. This was gained by descending again to the cellar, by surrendering the brass cheque to a burly doorkeeper, and by climbing a long flight of stairs into the upper regions. I went to the top of the building and down again, passing several floors filled with sleeping men. The cabins were the best accommodation, each cabin allowing space for a tiny bed and room alongside of it in which to undress. The bedding was clean, and with neither it nor the bed do I find any fault. But there was no privacy about it, no being alone. To get an adequate idea of a floor filled with cabins, you have merely to magnify a layer of the plasterboard pigeonholes of an egg crate, till each pigeonhole is 7 feet in height, and otherwise properly dimensioned. Then place the magnified layer on the floor of a large barn-like room, and there you have it. There are no ceilings to the pigeonholes, the walls are thin, and the snores from all the sleepers and every move and turn of your nearer neighbours come plainly to your ears. And this cabin is yours only for a little while. In the morning, out you go. You cannot put your trunk in it, or come and go when you like, or lock the door behind you, or anything of the sort. In fact, there is no door at all, only a doorway. If you care to remain a guest in this poor man's hotel, you must put up with all this, and with prison regulations which impress upon you constantly that you are nobody, with little soul of your own and less to say about it. Now I contend that the least a man who does his day's work should have is a room to himself, where he can lock the door and be safe in his possessions, where he can sit down and read by a window or look out, where he can come and go whenever he wishes, where he can accumulate a few personal belongings, other than those he carries about with him on his back and in his pockets, where he can hang up pictures of his mother, sister, sweetheart, ballet dancers, or bulldogs, as his heart listeth. In short, one place of his own on the earth of which he can say, "This is mine, my castle, the world stops at the threshold, here am I, lord and master." He will be a better citizen, this man, and he will do a better day's work. I stood on one floor of the poor man's hotel and listened. I went from bed to bed and looked at the sleepers. They were young men, from 20 to 40, most of them. Old men cannot afford the working man's home. They go to the workhouse. But I looked at the young men, scores of them, and they were not bad-looking fellows. Their faces were made for women's kisses, their necks for women's arms. They were lovable, as men are lovable. They were capable of love. A woman's touch redeems and softens, and they needed such redemption and softening, instead of each day growing harsh and harsher. And I wondered where these women were, and heard a harlot's ginny laugh. Leman Street, Waterloo Road, Piccadilly, the Strand answered me, and I knew where they were. Chapter 21. The Precariousness of Life. I was talking with a very vindictive man. In his opinion, his wife had wronged him, and the law had wronged him. The merits and morals of the case are immaterial. The meat of the matter is that she had obtained a separation, and he was compelled to pay 10 shillings each week for the support of her and the 5 children. "But look you," said he to me, "what'll happen to her if I don't pay up the 10 shillings? Supposing now, just supposing, an accident happens to me so I can't work. Supposing I get a rupture, or the rheumatics, or the cholera. What's she going to do, eh? What's she going to do?" He shook his head sadly. "No hope for her. The best she can do is the workhouse, and that's hell. And if she don't go to the workhouse, it'll be worse hell. Come along with me and I'll show you the women sleeping in the passage, a dozen of them, and I'll show you worse what she'll come to if anything happens to me and the 10 shillings. The certitude of this man's forecast is worthy of consideration. He knew conditions sufficiently to know the precariousness of his wife's grasp on food and shelter, for her game was up when his working capacity was impaired or destroyed. And when this state of affairs is looked at in its larger aspect, the same will be found true of hundreds of thousands and even millions of men and women living amicably together and cooperating in the pursuit of food and shelter. The figures are appalling. 1,800,000 people in London live on the poverty line and below it, and 1 million live within 1 week's wages between them and pauperism. In all England and Wales, 18% of the whole population are driven to the parish for relief, and in London, according to the statistics of the London County Council, 21% of the whole population are driven to the parish for relief. Between being driven to the parish for relief and being out-and-out pauper, there is a great difference. Yet London supports 123,000 paupers. Quite a city of folk in themselves. 1 in every 4 in London dies on public charity, while 939 out of every 1,000 in the United Kingdom die in poverty. 8 million simply struggle on the ragged edge of starvation, and 20 million more are not comfortable in the simple and clean sense of the word. It is interesting to go more into detail concerning the London people who die on charity. In 1886 and up to 1893, the percentage of pauperism to population was less in London than in all England. But since 1893 and for every succeeding year, the percentage of pauperism to population has been greater in London than in all England. Yet, from the Registrar General's report for 1886, the following figures are taken. Out of 81,951 deaths in London, 1884, in workhouses, 9,909. In hospitals, 6,559. In lunatic asylums, 278. Total in public refuges, 16,746. Commenting on these figures, a Fabian writer says, "Considering that comparatively few of these are children, it is possible that 1 in every 3 London adults will be driven into one of these refuges to die, and in proportion in the case of the manual labour class must of course be still larger." These figures serve somewhat to indicate the proximity of the average worker to pauperism. Various things make pauperism. An advertisement, for instance, such as this, appearing in yesterday morning's paper. Clerk wanted, with knowledge of shorthand, typing and invoicing. Wages 10 shillings, $2.50 a week. Apply by letter. And conditions. And in today's paper, I read of a clerk 35 years of age and an inmate of a London workhouse brought before a magistrate for non-performance of task. He claimed that he had done his various tasks since he had been an inmate, but when the master set him to breaking stones, his hands blistered and he could not finish the task. He had never been used to an implement heavier than a pen, he said. The magistrate sentenced him and his blistered hands to 7 days' hard labour. Old age, of course, makes pauperism. And then there is the accident, the thing happening, the death or disablement of the husband, father and breadwinner. Here is a man with a wife and 3 children, living on the ticklish security of 20 shillings per week, and there are hundreds of thousands of such families in London. Perforce, to even half exist, they must live up to the last penny of it, so that a week's wages, £1, is all that stands between this family and pauperism or starvation. The thing happens, the father is struck down, and what then? A mother with 3 children can do little or nothing. Either she must hand her children over to society as juvenile paupers, in order to be free to do something adequate for herself, or she must go to the sweatshops for work which she can perform in the most vile den possible to her reduced income. But with the sweatshops, married women who eke out their husbands' earnings, and single women who have but themselves miserably to support, determine the scale of wages. And this scale of wages, so determined, is so low that the mother and her 3 children can live only in positive beastliness and semi-starvation, till decay and death end their suffering. To show that this mother, with her 3 children to support, cannot compete in the sweating industries, I instance from the current newspapers the 2 following cases. A father indignantly writes that his daughter and a girl companion receive 8 shillings and 5 per gross for making boxes. They made each day 4 gross. Their expenses were 8 pence for car fare, 2 pence for stamps, 2.5 pence for glue, and 1 pence for string, so that they all earned between them was 1 shilling 9 pence, or a daily wage each of 10.5 pence. In the second, before the Luton Guardians a few days ago, an old woman of 72 appeared, asking for relief. She was a straw hat maker, but had been compelled to give up the work owing to the price she obtained for them, namely 2.25 pence each. For that price, she had to provide the plait trimmings and make and finish the hats. Yet this mother and her 3 children, we are considering, have done no wrong that she should be so punished. They have not sinned. The thing happened, that is all. The husband, father, and breadwinner was struck down. There is no guarding against it. It is fortuitous. A family stands so many chances of escaping the bottom of the abyss and so many chances of falling plump down into it. The chance is reducible to cold, pitiless figures, and a few of these figures will not be out of place. Sir A. Forward calculates that 1 of every 1,400 workmen is killed annually. 1 of every 2,500 workmen is totally disabled. 1 of every 300 workmen is permanently partially disabled. 1 of every 8 workmen is temporarily disabled 3 or 4 weeks. But these are only the accidents of industry. The high mortality of the people who live in the ghetto plays a terrible part. The average age at death among the people of the West End is 55 years. The average age at death among the people of the East End is 30 years. That is to say, the person in the West End has twice the chance for life that the person has in the East End. Talk of war. The mortality in South Africa and the Philippines fades away to insignificance. Here, in the heart of peace, is where the blood is being shed. And here not even the civilized rules of warfare obtain, for the women and children and babes in the arms are killed just as ferociously as the men are killed. War? In England every year, 500,000 men, women and children engaged in the various industries are killed and disabled or are injured to disablement by disease. In the West End, 18% of the children die before 5 years of age. In the East End, 55% of the children die before 5 years of age. And there are streets in London where out of every 100 children born in a year, 50 die during the next year. And of the 50 that remain, 25 die before they are 5 years old. Slaughter. Herod did not do quite so badly. That industry causes greater havoc with human life than battle does, no better substantiation can be given than the following extract from a recent report of the Liverpool medical officer, which is not applicable to Liverpool alone. In many instances, little if any sunlight could get to the courts, and the atmosphere within the dwellings was always foul, owing largely to the saturated condition of the walls and ceilings, which for so many years had absorbed the exhalations of the occupants into their porous material. Singular testimony to the absence of sunlight in these courts was furnished by the action of the Parks and Gardens Committee, who desired to brighten the homes of the poorest class by gifts of growing flowers and window boxes. But these gifts could not be made in courts such as these, as flowers and plants were susceptible to the unwholesome surroundings, and would not live. Mr. George Hoare has compiled the following table on the 3 St. George's parishes, London parishes. Percentage of population, death rate and overcrowded, per 1,000. St. George's West, death rate 10, overcrowded 13.2. St. George's South, death rate 35, overcrowded 23.7. St. George's East, death rate 40, overcrowded 26.4. Then there are the dangerous trades in which countless workers are employed. Their hold on life is indeed precarious, far, far more precarious than the hold of the 20th century soldier on life. In the linen trade, in the preparation of the flax, wet feet and wet clothes cause an unusual amount of bronchitis, pneumonia, and severe rheumatism, while in the carding and spinning departments, the fine dust produces lung disease in the majority of cases, and the woman who starts carding at 17 or 18 begins to break up and go to pieces at 30. The chemical labourers, picked from the strongest and most splendidly built men to be found, live, on an average, less than 48 years. Says Dr. Arledge of the potter's trade, potter's dust does not kill suddenly but settles year after year a little more firmly into the lungs, until at length a case of plaster is formed, breathing becomes more and more difficult and depressed, and finally ceases. steel dust, stone dust, clay dust, alkali dust, fluff dust, fibre dust. All these things kill, and they are more deadly than machine guns and pom-poms. Worst of all is the lead dust in the white lead trades. Here is a description of the typical dissolution of a young, healthy, well-developed girl who goes to work in a white lead factory. Here, after a varying degree of exposure, she becomes anemic. It may be that her gums show a very faint blue line, or perchance her teeth and gums are perfectly sound and no blue line is discernible. Coincidentally, with the anemia she has been getting thinner, but so gradually as scarcely to impress itself upon her or her friends. Sickness, however, ensues, and headaches, growing in intensity, are developed. These are frequently attended by obscuration of vision or temporary blindness. Such a girl passes into what appears to her friends and medical advisor as ordinary hysteria. This gradually deepens without warning until she is suddenly seized with a convulsion, beginning in one half of the face, then involving the arm, next the leg of the same side of the body, until the convulsion, violent and purely epileptic form in character, becomes universal. This is attended by loss of consciousness, out of which she passes into a series of convulsions gradually increasing in severity, in one of which she dies, or consciousness, partial or perfect, is regained, either, it may be, for a few minutes, a few hours, or days, during which violent headaches is complained of, or she is delirious and excited, as in acute mania, or dull and sullen, as in melancholia, and requires to be roused when she is found wandering, and her speech is somewhat imperfect. Without further warning, save that the pulse, which has become soft, with nearly the normal number of beats, all at once becomes low and hard, she is suddenly seized with another convulsion, in which she dies, or passes into a state of coma from which she never rallies. In another case, the convulsions will gradually subside, the headache disappears, and the patient recovers, only to find that she has completely lost her eyesight, a loss that may be temporary or permanent. And here are a few specific cases of white lead poisoning. Charlotte Rafferty, a fine, well-grown young woman with a splendid constitution, who had never had a day's illness in her life, became a white lead worker. Convulsions seized her at the foot of the ladder in the works. Dr. Oliver examined her, found the blue line along her gums, which shows that the system is under the influence of the lead. He knew that the convulsions would shortly return. They did so, and she died. Mary Ann Tola, a girl of 17, who had never had a fit in her life, 3 times became ill and had to leave off work in the factory. Before she was 19, she showed symptoms of lead poisoning, had fits, frothed at the mouth, and died. Mary A., an unusually vigorous woman, was able to work in the lead factory for 20 years, having colic once only during that time. Her 8 children all died in early infancy from convulsions. One morning, whilst brushing her hair, this woman suddenly lost all power in both her wrists. Elizabeth H., aged 25, after 5 months at Leadworks, was seized with colic. She entered another factory after being refused by the first one, and worked on uninterruptedly for 2 years. Then the former symptoms returned, she was seized with convulsions and died in 2 days of acute lead poisoning. Mr. Vaughan Nash, speaking of the unborn generation, says, "The children of the white lead worker enter the world, as a rule, only to die from the convulsions of lead poisoning. They are either born prematurely or die within the first year." And finally, Let me instance the case of Harriet A. Walker, a young girl of 17, killed while leading a forlorn hope on the industrial battlefield. She was employed as an enamelled ware-brusher wherein lead poisoning is encountered. Her father and brother were both out of employment. She concealed her illness, walked 6 miles a day to and from work, earned her 7 or 8 shillings per week, and died at 17. Depression in trade also plays an important part in hurling the workers into the abyss. With a week's wages between a family and pauperism, a month's enforced idleness means hardship and misery almost indescribable, and from the ravages of which the victims do not always recover when work is to be had again. Just now the daily papers contain the report of a meeting of the Carlisle branch of the Dockers' Union, wherein it is stated that many of the men, for months past, have not averaged a weekly income of more than from 4 to 5 shillings. The stagnated state of the shipping industry in the Port of London is held accountable for this condition of affairs. To the young working man or working woman or married couple, there is no assurance of happy or healthy middle life, nor of solvent old age. Work as they will, they cannot make their future secure. It is all a matter of chance. Everything depends upon the thing happening, the thing with which they have nothing to do. Precaution cannot fend it off, nor can wiles evade it. If they remain on the industrial battlefield, they must face it and take their chance against heavy odds. Of course, if they are favourably made, and are not tied by kinship duties, they may run away from the industrial battlefield. In which event, the safest thing the man can do is join the army, and for the woman, possibly to become a Red Cross nurse or go into a nunnery. In either case, they must forego home and children and all that makes life worth living, and old age other than a nightmare. Chapter 22. Suicide. With life so precarious and opportunity for the happiness of life so remote, it is inevitable that life shall be cheap and suicide common. So common it is that one cannot pick up a daily paper without running across it, while an attempt at suicide case in a police court excites no more interest than an ordinary drunk, and is handled with the same rapidity and unconcern. I remember such a case in the Thames Police Court. I pride myself that I have good eyes and ears, and a fair working knowledge of men and things, but I confess, as I stood in that courtroom, that I was half bewildered by the amazing dispatch with which drunks, disorderlies, vagrants, brawlers, wife-beaters, thieves, fences, gamblers, and women of the street went through the machine of justice. The dock stood in the centre of the court, where the light is best, and into it and out again stepped men, women, and children, in a stream as steady as the stream of sentences which fell from the magistrate's lips. I was still pondering over a consumptive fence, who had pleaded inability to work and necessity for supporting wife and children, and who had received a year at hard labour, when a young boy of about 20 appeared in the dock. Alfred Freeman. I caught his name, but failed to catch the charge. A stout and motherly-looking woman bobbed up in the witness box and began her testimony. Wife of the Britannia lock-keeper, I learned she was. Time, night, a splash. She ran to the lock and found the prisoner in the water. I flashed my gaze from her to him. So that was the charge, self-murder. He stood there dazed and unheeding, his bonny brown hair rumpled down his forehead, his face haggard and careworn and boyish still. "Yes, sir," the lock-keeper's wife was saying. "As fast as I pulled to get him out, he crawled back. Then I called for help, and some workmen happened along, and we got him out and turned him over to the constable." The magistrate complimented the woman on her muscular powers, and the courtroom laughed. But all I could see was a boy on the threshold of life, passionately crawling to muddy death, and there was no laughter in it. A man was now in the witness box, testifying to the boy's good character and giving extenuating evidence. He was the boy's foreman, or had been. Alfred was a good boy, but he had had lots of trouble at home, money matters. And then his mother was sick. He was given to worrying, and he worried over it till he laid himself out and wasn't fit for work. He, the foreman, for the sake of his own reputation, the boy's work being bad, had been forced to ask him to resign. "Anything to say?" the magistrate demanded abruptly. The boy in the dock mumbled something indistinctly. He was still dazed. "What does he say, constable?" the magistrate asked impatiently. The stalwart man in blue bent his ear to the prisoner's lips and then replied loudly, "He says he's very sorry, your worship." "Remanded," said his worship, and the next case was under way, the first witness already engaged in taking the oath. The boy, dazed and unheeding, passed out with the jailer. That was all, 5 minutes from start to finish, and 2 hulking brutes in the dock were trying strenuously to shift the responsibility of the possession of a stolen fishing pole worth probably 10 cents. The chief trouble with these poor folk is that they do not know how to commit suicide, and usually have to make 2 or 3 attempts before they succeed. This, very naturally, is a horrid nuisance to the constables and magistrates, and gives them no end of trouble. Sometimes, however, the magistrates are frankly outspoken about the matter, and censure the prisoners for their slackness of their attempts. For instance, Mr. R.S., chairman of the S.B. Magistrates, in the case the other day of Ann Wood, who tried to make away with herself in the canal. "If you wanted to do it, why didn't you do it and get it done with?" demanded the indignant Mr. R.S. "Why did you not get under the water and make an end of it, instead of giving us all this trouble and bother?" Poverty, misery, and fear of the workhouse are the principal causes of suicide among the working classes. "I'll drown myself before I go into the workhouse," said Ellen Hughes Hunt, aged 52. Last Wednesday, they held an inquest on her body at Shoreditch. Her husband came from the Islington workhouse to testify. He had been a cheesemonger, but failure in business and poverty had driven him into the workhouse, whither his wife had refused to accompany him. She was last seen at 1 in the morning. 3 hours later, her hat and jacket were found on the towing path by the Regent's Canal, and later her body was fished from the water. Verdict: suicide during temporary insanity. Such verdicts are crimes against the truth. The law is a lie, and through it men lie most shamelessly. For instance, a disgraced woman, forsaken and spat upon by kith and kin, doses herself and her baby with laudanum. The baby dies, but she pulls through after a few weeks in hospital, is charged with murder, convicted and sentenced to 10 years penal servitude. Recovering, the law holds her responsible for her actions. Yet, had she died, the same law would have rendered a verdict of temporary insanity. Now, considering the case of Ellen Hughes Hunt, it is as fair and logical to say that her husband was suffering from temporary insanity when he went into the Islington workhouse, as it is to say that she was suffering from temporary insanity when she went into the Regent's Canal. As to which is the preferable sojourning place is a matter of opinion of intellectual judgment. I, for one, from what I know of canals and workhouses, should choose the canal, were I in a similar position. And I make bold to contend that I am no more insane than Ellen Hughes Hunt, her husband, and the rest of the human herd. Man no longer follows instinct with the old natural fidelity. He has developed into a reasoning creature and can intellectually cling to life or discard life just as life happens to promise great pleasure or pain. I dare assert that Ellen Hughes Hunt defrauded and bilked of all the joys of life which 52 years' service in the world has earned, with nothing but the horrors of the workhouse before her, was very rational and level-headed when she elected to jump into the canal. And I dare to assert further that the jury had done a wiser thing to bring in a verdict charging society with temporary insanity for allowing Ellen Hughes Hunt to be defrauded and bilked of all the joys of life which 52 years' service in the world has earned. Temporary insanity, oh, these cursed phrases, these lies of language, under which people with meat in their bellies and whole shirts on their back shelter themselves, and evade the responsibility of their brothers and sisters, empty of belly and without whole shirts on their backs. From one issue of The Observer, an East End paper, I quote the following commonplace events. A ship's fireman, named Johnny King, was charged with attempting to commit suicide. On Wednesday, defendant went to Bow Police Station and stated that he had swallowed a quantity of phosphor paste, and he was hard up and unable to obtain work. King was taken inside and an emetic administered when he vomited up a quantity of the poison. Defendant now said he was very sorry. Although he had 16 years good character, he was unable to obtain work of any kind. Mr. Dickinson had defendant put back for the court missionary to see him. Timothy Warner, 32, was remanded for a similar offence. He jumped off Limehouse Pier, and when rescued said, "I intended to do it." A decent-looking woman named Ellen Gray was remanded on a charge of attempting to commit suicide. About 8:30 on Sunday morning, Constable 834K found defendant lying in a doorway in Benworth Street, and she was in a very drowsy condition. She was holding an empty bottle in one hand and stated that some 2 or 3 hours previously she had swallowed a quantity of laudanum. As she was evidently very ill, the divisional surgeon was sent for and, having administered some coffee, ordered that she was to be kept awake. When the defendant was charged, she stated that the reason why she had attempted to take her life was she had neither home nor friends. I do not say that all people who commit suicide are sane, no more than I say that all people who do not commit suicide are sane. Insecurity of food and shelter, by the way, is the great cause of insanity among the living. Costermongers, hawkers, and peddlers, a class of workers who live from hand to mouth more than those of any other class, form the highest percentage of those in the lunatic asylums. Among the males each year, 26.9 per 10,000 go insane, and among the women, 36.9. On the other hand, of soldiers, who are at least sure of food and shelter, 13 per 10,000 go insane, and of farmers and graziers, only 5.1. So a coster is twice as likely to lose his reason as a soldier, and 5 times as likely as a farmer. Misfortune and misery are very potent in turning people's heads, and drive one person to the lunatic asylum and another to the morgue or the gallows. When the thing happens, and the father and husband, for all of his love for his wife and children, and his willingness to work, can get no work to do, it is a simpler matter for his reason to totter, and the light within his brain goes out. And it is especially simple when it is taken into consideration that his body is ravaged by innutrition and disease, in addition to his soul being torn by the sight of his suffering wife and little ones. He is a good-looking man with a mass of black hair, dark expressive eyes, delicately chiselled nose and chin, and wavy fair moustache. This is the reporter's description of Frank Cavilla as he stood in court this dreary month of September, dressed in a much-worn grey suit and wearing no collar. Frank Cavilla lived and worked as a house decorator in London. He is described as a good workman, a steady fellow, and not given to drink, while all his neighbours unite in testifying that he was a gentle and affectionate husband and father. His wife, Hannah Cavilla, was a big, handsome, light-hearted woman. She saw to it that his children were sent neat and clean, the neighbours all remarked the fact, to the Childerick Road Board School. And so, with such a man, so blessed, working steadily and living temperately, all went well and the goose hung high. Then the thing happened. He worked for a Mr. Beck, builder, and lived in one of his master's houses in Trundley Road. Mr. Beck was thrown from his trap and killed. The thing was an unruly horse, and, as I say, it happened. Cavilla had to seek fresh employment and find another house. This occurred 18 months ago. For 18 months he fought the big fight. He got rooms in a little house in Batavia Road, but could not make both ends meet. Steady work could not be obtained. He struggled manfully at casual employment of all sorts, his wife and 4 children starving before his eyes. He starved himself and grew weak and fell ill. This was 3 months ago, and then there was absolutely no food at all. They made no complaint, spoke no word, but poor folk know. The housewives of Batavia Road sent them food, but so respectable were the Cavillas that the food was sent anonymously, mysteriously, so as not to hurt their pride. The thing had happened. He had fought and starved and suffered for 18 months. He got up one September morning early. He opened his pocket-knife. He cut the throat of his wife, Hannah Cavilla, aged 33. He cut the throat of his firstborn, Frank, aged 12. He cut the throat of his son, Walter, aged 8. He cut the throat of his daughter, Nellie, aged 4. He cut the throat of his youngest born, Ernest, aged 16 months. Then he watched beside the dead all day until the evening, when the police came, and he told them to put a penny in the slot of the gas meter in order that they might have light to see. Frank Cavilla stood in court, dressed in a much-worn grey suit and wearing no collar. He was a good-looking man with a mass of black hair, dark, expressive eyes, delicately chiselled nose and chin, and wavy, fair moustache. Chapter 23. The Children. Where home is a hovel, and dull we grovel, forgetting the world is fair. There is one beautiful sight in the East End, and only one, and it is the children dancing in the street when the organ grinder goes his round. It is fascinating to watch them, the newborn, the next generation, swaying and stepping with pretty little mimicries and graceful inventions all their own, with muscles that move swiftly and easily, and bodies that leap airily, weaving rhythms never taught in dancing school. I have talked with these children here, there, and everywhere, and they struck me as being bright as other children, and in many ways even brighter. They have most active little imaginations. Their capacity for projecting themselves into the realm of romance and fantasy is remarkable. A joyous life is romping in their blood. They delight in music and motion, and colour, and very often they betray a startling beauty of face and form under their filth and rags. But there is a Pied Piper of London town who steals them all away. They disappear. One never sees them again, or anything that suggests them. You may look for them in the vein amongst the generation of grown-ups. Here you will find stunted forms, ugly faces, and blunt and stolid minds. Grace, beauty, imagination, all the resilience of mind and muscle are gone. Sometimes, however, you may see a woman, not necessarily old, but twisted and deformed out of all womanhood, bloated and drunken, lift her draggled skirts and execute a few grotesque and lumbering steps upon the pavement. It is a hint that she was once one of those children who danced to the organ grinder. Those grotesque and lumbering steps are all that is left of the promise of childhood. In the befogged recesses of her brain has arisen a fleeting memory that she was once a girl. The crowd closes in. Little girls are dancing beside her, about her, with all the pretty graces she dimly recollects, but can no more than parody with her body. Then she pants for breath, exhausted, and stumbles out through the circle. But the little girls dance on. The children of the ghetto possess all the qualities which make for noble manhood and womanhood, but the ghetto itself, like an infuriating tigress turning on its young, turns upon and destroys all these qualities, blocks out the light and laughter, and moulds those it does not kill into sodden and forlorn creatures, uncouth, degraded, and wretched below the beasts of the field. As to the manner in which this is done, I have in previous chapters described it at length. Here let Professor Huxley describe it in brief. Anyone who is acquainted with the state of the population of all great industrial centres, whether in this or other countries, is aware that amidst a large and increasing body of that population there reigns supreme that condition which the French call la misère, a word for which I do not think there is any exact English equivalent. It is a condition in which the food, warmth, and clothing which are necessary for the mere maintenance of the functions of the body in their normal state cannot be obtained, in which men, women, and children are forced to crowd into dens wherein decency is abolished, and the most ordinary conditions of healthful existence are impossible of attainment, in which the pleasures within reach are reduced to brutality and drunkenness, in which the pains accumulate at compound interest, in the shape of starvation, disease, stunted development, and moral degradation, in which the prospect of even steady and honest industry is a life of unsuccessful battling with hunger, rounded by a pauper's grave. In such conditions, the outlook for children is hopeless. They die like flies, and those that survive because they possess excessive vitality and a capacity of adaptation to the degradation with which they are surrounded. They have no home life. In the dens and the lairs in which they live, they are exposed to all that is obscene and indecent. And as their minds are made rotten, so are their bodies made rotten by bad sanitation, overcrowding, and underfeeding. When a father and mother live with 3 or 4 children in a room, where the children take turn about in sitting up to drive rats away from the sleepers, when those children never have enough to eat, are preyed upon and made miserable and weak by swarming vermin, the sort of men and women the survivors will make can readily be imagined. Dull, despair and misery lie about them from their birth. Ugly curses, uglier mirth, are their ugliest lullaby. A man and a woman marry and set up housekeeping in one room. Their income does not increase with the years, though their family does, and the man is exceedingly lucky if he can keep his health and his job. A baby comes, and then another. This means that more room should be obtained, but these little mouths and bodies mean additional expense, and make it absolutely impossible to get more spacious quarters. More babies come. There is not room in which to turn around. The youngsters run the streets, and by the time they are 12 or 14, the room issue comes to a head, and out they go on the streets. The boy, if he be lucky, can manage to make the common lodging houses, and he may have one of several ends. But the girl of 14 or 15, forced in this manner to leave the one room called home, and able to earn at best a paltry 5 or 6 shillings per week, can have but one end. And the bitter end of that one end is such as that of the woman whose body the police found this morning in a doorway in Dorset Street, Whitechapel. Homeless, shelterless, sick, with no one with her in the last hour, she had died in the night of exposure. She was 62 years old and a match vendor. She died as a wild animal dies. Fresh in my mind is the picture of a boy in the dock of an East End police court. His head was barely visible above the railing. He was being proved guilty of stealing 2 shillings from a woman, which he had spent, not for candy and cakes and a good time, but for food. "Why didn't you ask the woman for food?" the magistrate demanded in a hurt sort of tone. "She would surely have given you something to eat." "If I'd asked her, I'd got locked up for begging," was the boy's reply. The magistrate knitted his brows and accepted the rebuke. Nobody knew the boy, nor his father or mother. He was without beginning or antecedent, a waif, a stray, a young cub seeking his foot in the jungle of empire, preying upon the weak and being preyed upon by the strong. The people who try to help, who gather up the ghetto children and send them away on a day's outing to the country, believe that not very many children reach the age of 10 without having had at least one day there. Of this a writer says, "The mental change caused by one day so spent must not be undervalued. Whatever the circumstances, the children learn the meaning of fields and woods, so that descriptions of country scenery in the books they read, which before conveyed no impression, become now intelligible. One day in the fields and woods, if they were lucky enough to be picked up by the people who try to help. And they are being born faster every day than they can be carted off to the fields and woods for the one day in their lives. One day. In all their lives, one day. And for the rest of the days, as the boy told a certain bishop, "At 10 we ops the wag, at 13 we nicks things, and at 16 we bashes the copper," which is to say, at 10 they play truant, at 13 steal, and at 16 are sufficiently developed hooligans to smash the policeman. The Reverend J. Cartmill Robinson tells of a boy and girl of his parish who set out to walk to the forest. They walked and walked through the never-ending streets, expecting always to see it by and by, until they sat down at last, faint and despairing, and were rescued by a kind woman who brought them back. Evidently they had been overlooked by the people who try to help. The same gentleman is authority for the statement that in a street in Hoxton, a district of the vast East End, over 700 children between 5 and 13 years live in 80 small houses. And he adds, "It is because London has largely shut her children in a maze of streets and houses and robbed them of their rightful inheritance in sky and field and brook, that they grow up to be men and women physically unfit." He tells of a member of his congregation who let a basement room to a married couple. They said they had 2 children. When they got possession, it turned out that they had 4. After a while, a 5th appeared, and the landlord gave them notice to quit. They paid no attention to it. The sanitary inspector, who has to wink at the law so often, came in and threatened my friend with legal proceedings. He pleaded that he could not get them out. They pleaded that nobody would have them with so many children at a rental within their means. which is one of the commonest complaints of the poor, by the by. What was to be done? The landlord between two millstones. Finally, he applied to the magistrate, who sent up an officer to inquire into the case. Since that time, about 20 days have elapsed, and nothing has yet been done. Is this a singular case? By no means. It is quite common. Last week, the police raided a disorderly house. In one room were found 2 young children. They were arrested and charged with being inmates, the same as the woman had been. Their father appeared at the trial. He stated that himself and wife and 2 older children, besides the 2 in the dock, occupied that room. He stated also that he occupied it because he could get no other room for the £0.50 a week he paid for it. The magistrate discharged the 2 juvenile offenders and warned the father that he was bringing his children up unhealthily. But there is no need further to multiply instances. In London, the slaughter of the innocents goes on a scale more stupendous than any before in the history of the world. And equally stupendous is the callousness of the people who believe in Christ, acknowledge God, and go to church regularly on Sunday. For the rest of the week, they riot about on the rents and profits which come to them from the East End, stained with the blood of the children. Also at times, so peculiarly are they made, they will take 500,000 of these rents and profits, and send it away to educate the black boys of the Sudan. Chapter 24. A Vision of the Night. All these were years ago, little red-coloured, pulpy infants, capable of being kneaded, baked into any social form you choose. Carlyle. Late last night I walked along Commercial Street from Spitalfields to Whitechapel, and still continuing south, down Leman Street to the docks. And as I walked, I smiled at the East End papers, which, filled with civic pride, boastfully proclaim that there is nothing the matter with the East End as a living place for men and women. It is rather hard to tell a tithe of what I saw. Much of it is untenable. But in a general way, I may say that I saw a nightmare, a fearful slime that quickened the pavement with life, a mess of unmentionable obscurity that put into eclipse the nightly horror of Piccadilly and the Strand. It was a menagerie of garmented bipeds that looked something like humans and more like beasts, and to complete the picture, brass-buttoned keepers kept order among them when they snarled too fiercely. I was glad the keepers were there, for I did not have on my seafaring clothes, and I was what is called a mark for the creatures of prey that prowled up and down. At times, between keepers, these males looked at me sharply, hungrily, gutter wolves that they were, and I was afraid of their hands, of their naked hands, as one may be afraid of the paws of a gorilla. They reminded me of gorillas. Their bodies were small, ill-shaped and squat. There were no swelling muscles, no abundant thews and wide-spreading shoulders. They exhibited rather an elemental economy of nature, such as the cavemen must have exhibited. But there was strength in those meagre bodies, the ferocious, primordial strength to clutch and gripe and tear and rend. When they spring upon their human prey, they are known even to bend the victim backward and double its body till the back is broken. They possess neither conscience nor sentiment, and they will kill for half a sovereign without fear or favour if they are given but half a chance. They are a new species, a breed of city savages. The streets and houses, alleys and courts are their hunting grounds. As valley and mountain are to the natural savage, street and building are valley and mountain to them. The slum is their jungle, and they live and pray in the jungle. Dear soft people of the golden theatres and wonder mansions of the West End do not see these creatures, do not dream that they exist. But they are here, alive, very much alive, in their jungle. And woe the day when England is fighting in her last trench and her able-bodied men are on the firing line. For on that day they will crawl out of their dens and lairs, and the people of the West End will see them, as the dear soft aristocrats of feudal France saw them and asked one another, whence came they? Are they men? But they were not the only beasts that ranged the menagerie. They were only here and there, lurking in dark courts and passing like grey shadows along the walls. But the women from whose rotten loins they spring were everywhere. They whined insolently, and in maudlin tones begged me for pennies, and worse. They held carouse in every boozing ken, slatternly, unkempt, bleary-eyed and towzled, leering and gibbering, overspilling with foulness and corruption, and, gone in debauch, sprawling across benches and bars, unspeakably repulsive, fearful to look upon. And there were others, strange weird faces and forms and twisted monstrosities that shouldered me on every side, inconceivable types of sodden ugliness, the wrecks of society, the perambulating carcasses, the living deaths, women, blasted by disease and drink till their shame brought not twopence in the open mart, and men, in fantastic rags, wrenched by hardship and exposure out of all semblance of men, their faces in a perpetual writhe of pain, grinning idiotically, shambling like apes, dying with every step they took and each breath they drew. And there were young girls of 18 and 20 with trim bodies and faces yet untouched with twist and bloat, who had fetched the bottom of the abyss plump in one swift fall. And I remember a lad of 14 and one of 6 or 7, white-faced and sickly, homeless, the pair of them, who sat upon the pavement with their backs against a railing and watched it all. The unfit and the unneeded. Industry does not clamour for them. There are no jobs going begging through lack of men and women. The dockers crowd at the entrance gate and curse and turn away when the foreman does not give them a call. The engineers, who have work, pay 6 shillings a week to their brother engineers who can find nothing to do. 514,000 textile workers oppose a resolution condemning the employment of children under 15. Women, and a plenty to spare, are foiled to toil under the sweatshop masters for 10 pence a day of 14 hours. Alfred Freeman crawls to muddy death because he loses his job. Ellen Hughes Hunt prefers Regent's Canal to Islington Workhouse. Frank Cavilla cuts the throats of his wife and children because he cannot find work enough to give them food and shelter. The unfit and the unneeded, the miserable and despised and forgotten, dying in the social shambles. The progeny of prostitution, of the prostitution of men and women and children, of flesh and blood and sparkle and spirit. In brief, the prostitution of labour. If this is the best that civilization can do for the human, then give us howling and naked savagery. Far better to be a people of the wilderness and desert, of the cave and the squatting place, than to be a people of the machine and the abyss. Chapter 25. The Hunger Whale. My father has more stamina than I, for he is country-born. The speaker, a bright young East Ender, was lamenting his poor physical development. Look at my scrawny arm, will you? He pulled up his sleeve. Not enough to eat, that's what's the matter with it. Oh, not now. I have what I want to eat these days. but it's too late. It can't make up for what I didn't have to eat when I was a kiddie. Dad came up to London from the Fen country. Mother died, and there were 6 of us kiddies, and Dad living in 2 small rooms. He had hard times, Dad did. He might have chucked us, but he didn't. He slaved all day, and at night he came home and cooked and cared for us. He was father and mother both. He did his best, but we didn't have enough to eat. We rarely saw meat, and then of the worst. And it's not good for growing kiddies to sit down to a dinner of bread and a bit of cheese, and not enough of it. And what's the result? I'm undersized, and I haven't the stamina of me dad. It was starved out of me. In a couple of generations, there'll be no more of me here in London. Yet there's me younger brother. He's bigger and better developed. You see, Dad and we children held together, and that accounts for it. But I don't see, I objected. I should think, under such conditions, that the vitality should decrease and the younger children be born weaker and weaker. Not when they're held together, he replied. Whenever you come along in the East End and see a child from 8 to 12, good-sized, well-developed, and healthy-looking, just you ask, and you will find that it is the youngest in the family, or at least is one of the younger. The way of it is this. The older children starve more than the younger ones. By the time the young ones come along, the older ones are starting to work, and there is more money coming in and more food to go around. He pulled down his sleeve, a concrete instance of where chronic semi-starvation kills not, but stunts. His voice was but one among the myriads that raise the cry of hunger wail in the greatest empire in the world. On any one day, over 1 million people are in receipt of poor law relief in the United Kingdom. 1 in 11 of the whole working class receive poor law relief in the course of the year. 37,500,000 people receive less than £12 per month per family, and a constant army of 8 million lives on the border of starvation. A committee of the London County School Board makes this declaration. At times, when there is no special distress, 55,000 children are in a state of hunger, which makes it useless to attempt to teach them, are in the schools of London alone. The italics are mine. When there is no special distress means good times in England, for the people of England have come to look upon starvation and suffering, which they call distress, as part of the social order. Chronic starvation is looked upon as a matter of course. It is only when acute starvation makes its appearance on a large scale that they think something is unusual. I shall never forget the bitter wail of a blind man in a little East End shop at the close of a murky day. He had been the eldest of 5 children, with a mother and no father. Being the eldest, he had starved and worked as a child to put bread into the mouths of his little brothers and sisters. Not once in 3 months did he ever taste meat. He never knew what it was to have his hunger thoroughly appeased, and he claimed that this chronic starvation of his childhood had robbed him of his sight. To support the claim, he quoted from the report of the Royal Commission on the Blind. Blindness is more prevalent in poor districts, and poverty accelerates this dreadful affliction. But he went further, this blind man, and in his voice was the bitterness of an afflicted man to whom society did not give enough to eat. He was one of an enormous army of blind in London, and he said that in the blind homes they did not receive half enough to eat. He gave the diet for a day. Breakfast, 0.75 of a pint of skilly and dry bread. Dinner, 3 ounces of meat, 1 slice of bread, half a pound of potatoes. Supper, 0.75 of a pint of skilly and dry bread. Oscar Wilde, God rest his soul, voices the cry of the prison child, which, in varying degree, is the cry of the prison man and woman. The second thing from which a child suffers in prison is hunger. The food that is given to it consists of a piece of usually bad-baked prison bread and a tin of water for breakfast at 7:30. At 12 o'clock it gets dinner, composed of a tin of coarse Indian meal stirabout, skilly, and at 5:30 it gets a piece of dry bread and a tin of water for its supper. This diet in the case of a strong-grown man is always productive of illness of some kind, chiefly of coarse diarrhea, with its attendant weakness. In fact, in a big prison, astringent medicines are served out regularly by the warders as a matter of course. In the case of a child, the child is, as a rule, incapable of eating the food at all. Anyone who knows anything about children knows how easily a child's digestion is upset by a fit of crying or trouble and mental distress of any kind. A child who has been crying all day long and perhaps half the night in a lonely, dim-lit cell and is preyed upon by terror simply cannot eat food of this coarse, horrible kind. In the case of the little child to whom Warder Martin gave the biscuits, the child was crying with hunger on Tuesday morning and utterly unable to eat the bread and water served to it for its breakfast. Martin went out after the breakfasts had been served and brought the few sweet biscuits for the child rather than see it starving. It was a beautiful action on his part, and was so recognized by the child, who, utterly unconscious of the regulations of the prison board, told one of the senior wardens how kind this junior warden had been to him. The result was, of course, a report and a dismissal. Robert Blanchford compares the workhouse pauper's daily diet with the soldier's, which, when he was a soldier, was not considered liberal enough, and yet it's twice as liberal as the pauper's. Pauper, 3.25 ounce of meat, soldier, 12 ounce of meat. Pauper, 15.5 ounce of bread, soldier, 24 ounce of bread. Pauper, 6 ounce of vegetables, soldier, 8 ounce of vegetables. The adult male pauper gets meat outside of soup but once a week, and the paupers have nearly all that pallid, pasty complexion which is the sure mark of starvation. Here is a table comparing the workhouse officer's weekly allowance. Officer diet, 7 pounds of bread. Pauper, 6.75 pounds of bread. Officer, 5 pounds of meat. Pauper, 1 pound 2 ounce of meat. Officer, 12 ounce of bacon. Pauper, 2.5 ounce of bacon. Officer, 8 ounce of cheese. Pauper, 2 ounce of cheese. Officer, 7 pound potatoes. Pauper, 1.5 pound potatoes. Officer, 6 pound of vegetables. Pauper, none. Officer, 1 pound of flour. Pauper, none. Officer, 2 ounce of lard. Pauper, none. Officer, 2 ounce of lard. Pauper, none. Officer, 12 ounce of butter. Pauper, 7 ounce of butter. Officer, rice pudding, none. Pauper, rice pudding, 1 pound. And as the same writer remarks, the officer's diet is still more liberal than the pauper's, but evidently it is not considered liberal enough, for a footnote is added to the officer's table saying that a cash payment of 2 shillings and 6pence a week is also made to each resident officer and servant. If the pauper has ample food, why does the officer have more? And if the officer has not too much, can the pauper be properly fed on less than half the amount? But it is not alone the ghetto dweller, the prisoner, and the pauper that starve. Hodge of the country does not know what it is always to have a full belly. In truth, it is his empty belly which has driven him to the city in such great numbers. Let us investigate the way of living of a labourer from a parish in the Bradford Poor Law Union, Berkshire. Supposing him to have 2 children, steady work, a rent-free cottage, and an average weekly wage of 13 shillings, which is the equivalent to $3.25. Then here is his weekly budget. Bread, 5 quarterns, 1 shilling 10pence. Flour, 0.5 of a gallon, 4p. Tea, 0.25 pound, 6p. Butter, 1 pound, 1 shilling 3p. Lard, 1 pound, 6p. Sugar, 6 pound, 1 shilling. Bacon or other meat, about 0.25 pound, 2 shillings and 8p. Cheese, 1 pound, 8p. Milk, half tin condensed, 3.25 . Coal, 1 shilling 6p. Beer, none. Tobacco, none. Insurance, Prudential, 3p. Labourers' Union, 1p. Wood, tools, dispensary, etc., 6p. Insurance, foresters and margin, 1 shilling. And for clothes, 1.75. Total, 13 shillings. The guardians of the workhouse in the above union pride themselves on their rigid economy. It costs per pauper per week, men 6 shillings and 1.5. Women 5 shillings 6.5. Children 5 shillings 1.25. If the labourer whose budget has been described should quit his toil and go into the workhouse, he would cost the guardians for himself 6 shillings 1.5, wife 5 shillings 6.5, 2 children 10 shillings 2.5. Total 21 shillings 10.5, or roughly $5.46. It would require more than a guinea for the workhouse to care for him and his family, which he, somehow, manages to do on 13 shillings. And in addition, it is an understood fact that it is cheaper to cater for a large number of people, buying, cooking, and serving wholesale, than it is to cater for a small number of people, say a family. Nevertheless, at the time this budget was compiled, there was in that parish another family, not of 4, but of 11 persons, who had to live on an income not of 13 shillings, but of 12 shillings per week, 11 shillings in winter, and which had not a rent-free cottage, but a cottage for which it paid 3 shillings per week. This must be understood, and understood clearly. Whatever is true of London in the way of poverty and degradation is true of all England. While Paris is not by any means France, the City of London is England. The frightful conditions which mark London an inferno likewise mark the United Kingdom an inferno. The argument that the decentralization of London would ameliorate conditions is a vain thing and false. If the 6 million people of London were separated into 100 cities each with a population of 60,000, misery would be decentralized but not diminished. The sum of it would remain as large. In this instance, Mr. B.S. Rowntree, by an exhaustive analysis, has proved for the country town what Mr. Charles Booth has proved for the metropolis, that fully 1/4 of the dwellers are condemned to a poverty which destroys them physically and spiritually, that fully 1/4 of the dwellers do not have enough to eat, are inadequately clothed, sheltered, and warmed in a rigorous climate, and are doomed to a moral degeneracy which puts them lower than the savage in cleanliness and decency. After listening to the wail of an old Irish peasant in Kerry, Robert Blatchford asked him what he wanted. The old man leaned upon his spade and looked out across the black peat fields at the lowering skies. "What is it that I'm wantin'?" he said. Then in a deep plaintive tone he continued, more to himself than to me, "All our brave boys and dear girls is away over the seas, and the agent has taken the peg off me, and the wet has spoiled the praties, and I'm an old man, and I want the day of judgment." The day of judgment, more than he wanted. From all the land rises the hunger wail, from ghetto and countryside, from prison and casual ward, from asylum and workhouse, the cry of the people who have not enough to eat. Millions of people, men, women, children, little babes, the blind, the deaf, the halt, the sick, vagabonds and toilers, prisoners and paupers, the people of Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, who have not enough to eat. And this in the face of the fact that 5 men can produce bread for 1,000, that 1 workman can produce cotton cloth for 250 people, woolens for 300, and boots and shoes for 1,000. It would seem that 40 million people are keeping a big house, and that they are keeping it badly. The income is all right, but there is something criminally wrong with the management. And who dares to say that it is not criminally mismanaged, this big house, when 5 men can produce bread for 1,000, yet millions have not enough to eat? Chapter 26. Drink, Temperance and Thrift. The English working classes may be said to be soaked in beer. They are made dull and sodden by it. Their efficiency is sadly impaired, and they lose whatever imagination, invention, and quickness may be theirs by right of race. It may hardly be called an acquired habit, for they are accustomed to it from the earliest infancy. Children are begotten in drunkenness, saturated in drink before they draw their first breath, born to the smell and taste of it, and brought up in the midst of it. The public house is ubiquitous. It flourishes on every corner and between corners, and it is frequented almost as much by women as by men. Children are to be found in it as well, waiting till their fathers and mothers are ready to go home, sipping from the glasses of their elders, listening to the coarse language and degrading conversation, catching the contagion of it, familiarizing themselves with licentiousness and debauchery. Mrs. Grundy rules as supremely over the workers as she does over the bourgeoisie, but in the case of the workers, the one thing she does not frown upon is the public house. No disgrace or shame attaches to it, nor to the young woman or girl who makes a practice of entering it. I remember a girl in a coffee house saying, "I never drink spirits when in a public house." She was a young and pretty waitress, and she was laying down to another waitress her preeminent respectability and discretion. Mrs. Grundy drew the line at spirits, but allowed that it was quite proper for a clean young girl to drink beer, and to go into a public house to drink it. Not only is this beer unfit for the people to drink, but too often the men and women are unfit to drink it. On the other hand, it is their very unfitness that drives them to drink it. Ill-fed, suffering from innutrition, and the evil effects of overcrowding and squalor, their constitutions develop a morbid craving for the drink, just as the sickly stomach of the overstrung Manchester factory operative hankers after excessive quantities of pickles and similar weird foods. Unhealthy working and living agendas, unhealthy appetites and desires. Man cannot be worked worse than a horse is worked, and be housed and fed as a pig is housed and fed, and at the same time have clean and wholesome ideals and aspirations. As home life vanishes, the public house appears. Not only do men and women abnormally crave drink, who are overworked, exhausted, suffering from deranged stomachs and bad sanitation, and deadened by the ugliness and monotony of existence, by the gregarious men and women who have no home life, flee to the bright and clattering public house in a vain attempt to express their gregariousness. And when a family is housed in one small room, home life is impossible. A brief examination of such a dwelling will serve to bring to light one important cause of drunkenness. Here the family arises in the morning, dresses and makes its toilet, father, mother, sons and daughters, and in the same room, shoulder to shoulder, for the room is small. The wife and mother cooks the breakfast. And in the same room, heavy and sickening with the exhalations of their packed bodies throughout the night, that breakfast is eaten. The father goes to work, the elder children go to school or into the street, and the mother remains with her crawling, toddling youngsters to do her housework, still in the same room. Here she washes the clothes, filling the pent space with soap suds and the smell of dirty clothes, and overhead she hangs the wet linen to dry. Here, in the evening, amid the manifold smells of the day, the family goes to its virtuous couch. That is to say, as many as possible pile into the one bed, if a bed they have, and the surplus turns in on the floor. And this is the round of their existence, month after month, year after year, for they never get a vacation save when they are evicted. When a child dies, and some are always bound to die, since 55% of the East End children die before they are 5 years old, the body is laid out in the same room, and if they are very poor, it is kept for some time until they can bury it. During the day it lies on the bed. During the night, when the living take the bed, the dead occupies the table, from which in the morning, when the dead is put back into the bed, they eat their breakfast. Sometimes the body is placed on the shelf, which serves as a pantry for their food. Only a couple of weeks ago, an East End woman was in trouble because, in this fashion, being unable to bury it, she had kept her dead child 3 weeks. Now such a room as I have described is not home, but horror, and the men and women who flee away from it to the public house are to be pitied, not blamed. There are 300,000 people in London, divided into families that live in single rooms, while there are 900,000 who are illegally housed according to the Public Health Act of 1891, a respectable recruiting ground for the drink traffic. Then there are the insecurity of happiness, the precariousness of existence, the well-founded fear of the future, potent factors in driving people to drink. Wretchedness squirms for alleviation, and in the public house its pain is eased and forgetfulness is obtained. It is unhealthy. Certainly it is, but everything else about their lives is unhealthy, while this brings the oblivion that nothing else in their lives can bring. It even exalts them, and makes them feel that they are finer and better, though at the same time it drags them down and makes them more beastly than ever. For the unfortunate man or woman, it is a race between miseries that ends with death. It is of no avail to preach temperance and teetotalism to these people. The drink habit may be the cause of many miseries, but it is, in turn, the effect of the other and prior miseries. The temperance advocates may preach their hearts out over the evils of drink, but until the evils that cause people to drink are abolished, drink and its evils will remain. Until the people who try to help realize this, their well-intentioned efforts will be futile, and they will present a spectacle fit only to set Olympus laughing. I have gone through an exhibition of Japanese art, got up for the poor of Whitechapel with the idea of elevating them, of begetting in them yearnings for the beautiful and true and good. Granting what is not so, that the poor folk are thus taught to know and yearn after the beautiful and true and good, the foul facts of their existence and the social law that dooms 1 in 3 to a public charity death, demonstrate that this knowledge and yearning will be only so much of an added curse to them. They will have so much more to forget than if they had never known and yearned. Did destiny today bind me down to the life of an East End slave for the rest of my years? And did destiny grant me but one wish? I should ask that I might forget all about the beautiful and true and good, that I might forget all I had learned from the open books, and forget the people I had known, the things I had heard, and the lands I had seen. And if destiny didn't grant it, I am pretty confident that I should get drunk and forget it as often as possible. These people who try to help, their college settlements, missions, charities, and what-nots are failures. In the nature of things they cannot but be failures. They are wrongly, though sincerely conceived. They approach life through a misunderstanding of life, these good folk. They do not understand the West End, yet they come down to the East End as teachers and savants. They do not understand the simple sociology of Christ, yet they come to the miserable and the despised with the pomp of social redeemers. They have worked faithfully, but beyond relieving an infinitesimal fraction of misery and collecting a certain amount of data, which might otherwise have been more scientifically and less expensively collected, they have achieved nothing. As someone has said, they do everything for the poor except get off their backs. The very money they dribble out in their child's schemes has been wrung from the poor. They come from a race of successful and predatory bipeds who stand between the worker and his wages, and they try to tell the worker what he shall do with the pitiful balance left to him. Of what use in the name of God is it to establish nurseries for women workers, in which, for instance, a child is taken while the mother makes violets in Islington at 3 farthings a gross, when more children and violet makers than they can cope with are being born right along? This violet maker handles each flower 4 times, 576 handlings for 3 farthings, and in the day she handles the flowers 6,912 times for a wage of 9pence. She is being robbed. Somebody is on her back, and a yearning for the beautiful and true and good will not lighten her burden. They do nothing for her, these dabblers, and what they do not do for the mother undoes at night when the child comes home all that they have done for the child in the day. And one and all they join in teaching a fundamental lie. They do not know it is a lie, but their ignorance does not make it more of a truth. And the lie they preach is thrift. An instant will demonstrate it. In overcrowded London, the struggle for a chance to work is keen, and because of this struggle, wages sink to the lowest means of subsistence. To be thrifty means for a worker to spend less than his income. In other words, to live on less. This is equivalent to a lowering of the standard of living. In the competition for a chance to work, the man with the lower standard of living will underbid the man with a higher standard. And a small group of such thrifty workers in any overcrowded industry will permanently lower the wages of that industry. And the thrifty ones will no longer be thrifty, for their income will have been reduced till it balances their expenditure. In short, thrift negates thrift. If every worker in England should heed the preachers of thrift and cut expenditure in half, the condition of there being more men to work than there is work to do would swiftly cut wages in half. And then none of the workers of England would be thrifty, for they would be living up to their diminished incomes. The short-sighted thrift preachers would naturally be astounded at the outcome. The measure of their failure would be precisely the measure of the success of their propaganda. And anyway, it is sheer bosh and nonsense to preach thrift to the 1,800,000 London workers who are divided into families which have a total income of less than 21 shillings per week, 1/4 to 1/2 of which must be paid for rent. Concerning the futility of the people who try to help, I wish to make one notable, noble exception, namely the Dr. Bernardo homes. Dr. Bernardo is a child catcher. First, he catches them when they are young, before they are set, hardened in the vicious social mould, and then he sends them away to grow up and be formed in another and better social mould. Up to date, he has sent out of the country 13,340 boys, most of them to Canada, and not one in 50 has failed. A splendid record when it is considered that these lads are waifs and strays, homeless and parentless, jerked out from the very bottom of the abyss, and 49 out of 50 of them made into men. Every 24 hours in the year, Dr. Bernardo snatches 9 waifs from the streets, so the enormous field he has to work in may be comprehended. The people who try to help have something to learn from him. He does not play with palliatives. He traces social viciousness and misery to their sources. He removes the progeny of the gutter folk from their pestilential environment and gives them a healthy, wholesome environment in which to be pressed and prodded and moulded into men. When the people who try to help cease their playing and dabbling with day nurseries and Japanese art exhibits and go back to learn their West End and the sociology of Christ, they will be in better shape to buckle down to the work they ought to be doing in the world. And if they do buckle down to the work, they will follow Dr. Bernardo's lead, only on a scale as large as the nation is large. They won't cram yearnings for the beautiful and true and good down the throat of the woman making violets for 3 farthings a gross, but they will make somebody get off her back and quit cramming himself till, like the Romans, he must go to a bath and sweat it out. And to their consternation, they will find that they will have to get off that woman's back themselves, as well as the backs of a few other women and children they did not dream they were riding upon. Chapter 27. The Management. In this final chapter, it were well to look at the social abyss in its widest aspect, and put certain questions to civilization, by the answers to which civilization must stand or fall. For instance, has civilization bettered the lot of man? Man, I use it in its democratic sense, meaning the average man. So the question reshapes itself, has civilization bettered the lot of the average man? Let us see. In Alaska, along the banks of the Yukon River, near its mouth, live the Inuit folk. They are a primitive people, manifesting but mere glimmering adumbrations of that tremendous artifice, civilization. Their capital amounts possibly to £2 per head. They hunt and fish for their food with bone-headed spews and arrows. They never suffer from lack of shelter. Their clothes, largely made from the skins of animals, are warm. They always have fuel for their fires, likewise timber for their houses, which they build partly underground, and in which they lie snugly during the periods of intense cold. In the summer they live in tents, open to every breeze and cool. They are healthy and strong and happy. Their one problem is food. They have their times of plenty and times of famine. In good times they feast, in bad times they die of starvation. But starvation, as a chronic condition, present with a large number of them all the time, is a thing unknown. Further, they have no debts. In the United Kingdom, on the rim of the Western Ocean, live the English folk. They are consummately civilized people. Their capital amounts to at least 300 per head. They gain their food not by hunting and fishing, but by toil at colossal artifices. For the most part, they suffer from lack of shelter. The great number of them are vilely housed, do not have enough fuel to keep them warm, and are insufficiently clothed. A constant number, never have any house at all, and sleep shelterless under the stars. Many are to be found, winter and summer, shivering on the streets in their rags. They have good times and bad. In good times, most of them manage to get enough to eat. In bad times, they die of starvation. They are dying now. They are dying yesterday and last year. They will die tomorrow and next year of starvation. For they, unlike the Inuit, suffer from a chronic condition of starvation. There are 40 million of the English folk, and 939 out of every 1,000 of them die in poverty, while a constant army of 8 million struggles on the ragged edge of starvation. Further, each babe that is born in debt to the sum of £22. This is because of an artifice called the national debt. In a fair comparison of the average Inuit and the average Englishman, it will be seen that life is less rigorous for the Inuit, that while the Inuit suffers only during bad times from starvation, the Englishman suffers during good times as well, that no Inuit lacks fuel, clothing, or housing, while the Englishman is in perpetual lack of these three essentials. In this connection, it is well to instance the judgment of a man such as Huxley. From the knowledge gained as a medical officer in the East End of London, and as a scientist pursuing investigations among the most elemental savages, he concludes, "Were the alternative presented to me, I would deliberately prefer the life of the savage to that of those people of Christian London. The creature comforts man enjoys are the products of man's labour. Since civilization has failed to give the average Englishman food and shelter equal to that enjoyed by the Inuit, the question arises, has civilization increased the producing power of the average man? If it has not increased man's producing power, then civilization cannot stand. But it will be instantly admitted, civilization has increased man's producing power. 5 men can produce bread for 1,000. 1 man can produce cotton cloth for 250 people, woolens for 300, and boots and shoes for 1,000. Yet it has been shown throughout the pages of this book that English folk by the millions do not receive enough food, clothes, and boots. Then arises the third and inexorable question. If civilization has increased the producing power of the average man, why has it not bettered the lot of the average man? There can be one answer only: mismanagement. Civilization has made possible all manner of creature comforts and heart's delights. In these the average Englishman does not participate. If he shall be forever unable to participate, then civilization falls. There is no reason for the continued existence of an artifice so avowed a failure, but it is impossible that men should have reared this tremendous artifice in vain. It stuns the intellect. To acknowledge so crushing a defeat is to give the death blow to striving and progress. One other alternative, and one other only, presents itself. Civilization must be compelled to better the lot of the average man. This accepted, it becomes at once a question of business management. Things profitable must be continued. Things unprofitable must be eliminated. Either the empire is a profit to England, or it is a loss. If it is a loss, it must be done away with. If it is a profit, it must be managed so that the average man comes in for a share of the profit. If the struggle for commercial supremacy is profitable, continue it. If it is not, if it hurts the worker and makes his lot worse than the lot of a savage, then fling foreign markets and industrial empire overboard. For it is a patent fact that if 40 million people, aided by civilization, possess a greater individual producing power than the Inuit, then those 40 million people should enjoy more creature comforts and heart's delights than the Inuits enjoy. If the 400,000 English gentlemen of no occupation, according to their own statement in the census of 1881, are unprofitable, do away with them. Set them to work ploughing game preserves and planting potatoes. If they are profitable, continue them by all means, but let it be seen so that the average Englishman shares somewhat in the profits they produce by working at no occupation. In short, society must be reorganized and a capable management put at the head. That the present management is incapable, there can be no discussion. It has drained the United Kingdom of its lifeblood. It has enfeebled the stay-at-home folk till they are unable longer to struggle in the van of the competing nations. It has built up a West End and an East End as large as the kingdom is large, in which one end is riotous and rotten, and the other end sickly and underfed. A vast empire is foundering on the hands of this incapable management, and by empire is meant the political machinery which holds together the English-speaking people of the world outside of the United States. Nor is this charged in a pessimistic spirit. Blood empire is greater than political empire, and the English of the New World and the Antipodes are strong and vigorous as ever. But the political empire under which they are nominally assembled is perishing. The political machine known as the British Empire is running down. In the hands of its management, it is losing momentum every day. It is inevitable that this management, which is grossly and criminally mismanaged, shall be swept away. Not only has it been wasteful and inefficient, but it has misappropriated the funds. Every worn-out, pasty-faced pauper, every blind man, every prison babe, every man, woman, and child whose belly is gnawing with hunger pangs is hungry because the funds have been misappropriated by the management. Nor can one member of this managing class plead not guilty before the judgment bar of man. The living in their houses and in their graves the dead are challenged by every babe that dies of innutrition, by every girl that flees the sweater's den to the nightly promenade of Piccadilly, by every worked-out toiler that plunges into the canal. The food this managing class eats, the wine it drinks, the show it makes, and the fine clothes it wears are challenged by 8 million mouths which have never had enough to fill them, and by twice 8 million bodies which have never been sufficiently clothed and housed. There can be no mistake. Civilization has increased man's producing power 100-fold, and through mismanagement the men of civilization live worse than the beasts, and have less to eat and wear and protect them from the elements than the savage Inuit in a frigid climate who lives day to day as he lived in the Stone Age 10,000 years ago. Challenge. I have a vague remembrance of a story that is told in some ancient Spanish legend or chronicle of old. It was when brave King Sanche was before Zamora slain, and his great besieging army lay encamped upon the plain. Don Diego de Ordenez sallied forth in front of all, and shouted loud his challenge to the warders on the wall. All the people of Zamora, both the born and the unborn, as traitors did he challenge with taunting words of scorn. The living in their houses, and in their graves the dead, and the water in their rivers, and their wine and oil and bread. There is a greater army that besets us round with strife, a starving, numberless army at all the gates of life. The poverty-stricken millions, who challenge our wine and bread, and impeach us all as traitors before the living and the dead. And whenever I sit at the banquet, where the feast and song are high, amid the mirth and music, I can hear that fearful cry. And hollow and haggard faces look into the lighted hall, and wasted hands are extended to catch the crumbs that fall. And within there is light and plenty, and odours fill the air, but without there is cold and darkness, and hunger and despair. And there in the camp of famine, in wind and cold and rain, Christ, the great Lord of the army, lies dead upon the plain. Longfellow. The End. Footnotes. 1. This in the Klondike, by Jack London. 2. Runt, in America, is the equivalent of the English crow, the dwarf of the litter. 3. The San Francisco bricklayer receives 20 shillings per day and at present is on strike for 24 shillings.